Welcome back, everybody, to the Chaplaincy on the Go podcast. My name's Josh Zorhoff, and I am your host. And this podcast is brought to you by the Fearless Chaplaincy and my good friends at Care Portal. Care Portal is a technology platform that helps individuals who are at risk of entering into the foster care system get the resources and the support they need so they can stay together as a forever family. And we are so grateful for their partnership in the chaplaincy. And I'm excited for the conversation today. Joining us on the podcast is a new friend to me. His name is Mike Maddox, and you're going to get to know him really well as we journey in. But Mike has had a long history with owning a business, working through some personal anxiety. He does a lot of leadership work now and some consulting. And I'm just really thankful for Mike to join us on this podcast. So Mike, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Josh, thanks for having me on. I've been looking forward to this.
Mike, tell us a little bit about your current work, what you're doing. You do some work in leadership coaching. You have a specific kind of coaching method and tool that you work through. So tell us about that a little bit.
I work with leadership teams at for-profit and non-for-profit businesses, helping them really do three things: get aligned as a leadership team on the vision, on where they're headed, 100% aligned as a team, and then share that vision with the rest of their organization, build traction and accountability into their organization through metrics and accountability and good leadership management and accountability tools, and really start to operate in a healthy way. Because I think over time, businesses, whether you're a for-profit or a not-for-profit, if you're a growing entity, you hit these ceilings and you start to operate in somewhat unhealthy ways. So I help them break through that. And as far as the methodology I use a methodology that's called the Entrepreneurial Operating System, or EOS. Listeners may have heard of that, based on a book called Traction by Gino Wickman. I had experienced the power of that comprehensive set of tools and processes in my own business, and then took it to a larger business that I sold my company to, and just became enamored with what it was capable of doing in those areas, and started coaching other businesses to get the same kind of results. So that's what I do day in and day out.
That's pretty fantastic. You know, I was actually in a meeting the other day talking with a team, a group at one of the chaplaincy partners I have is Halyard Construction. They do a lot of interior construction work in Grand Rapids area. And they've been processing through EOS, and they were talking that language. And I was like, hey, do you know Mike Maddox? And a guy named Sean Seal, who is their COO, is like, yeah, I know Mike. And I'm like, this is wild. Like, my worlds are colliding. So that was just super fun.
Yeah, I know Sean, and a great guy, and I'm really glad to hear things are going well for them.
Yeah, so it was just really cool, and just a cool moment for me to just put in a little connection there of the world of chaplaincy and leadership, and then of course entering into the conversation of mental health, which in a large part is why you're here on the podcast, to share a little bit of your own passion in that and your own journey. And I'm just curious, Mike, if you would just take a minute and share with those listening, what has been your experience with anxiety and mental health in your personal life, and then of course as you've seen it play out in the workspace?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, I'm a guy who has, I like to call myself, Josh, the poster boy for anxiety disorder, because I think I've tried every form of anxiety disorder there is in my life. From OCD to panic disorder to generalized anxiety to, even at one stage in my 20s, probably some agoraphobia, or a slight version of agoraphobia. And it wasn't until, I recognized those things early in my life as a kid. I can think back being in elementary school and thinking like, there was something different about me. Like when I would walk home from school, I had to step on certain parts of the sidewalk, or if I touched my face on this side, I had to touch it on this side and make it even. And I remember thinking that that's weird. Like other people don't do that. I didn't know back then what it was. Later in my late teen years, as I went off to college, I started to get more aggressive symptoms of anxiety, panic, and things of that nature. And it wasn't for even a few more years after that that I really got diagnosed with what they called OCD. It was the first time I ever heard that term. And that began kind of this amazing adventure of exploring what is this thing, anxiety. And as a person of faith who believes that God is in control, my initial reactions were very not scriptural because I looked at it like, well, this must be a lack of faith. This must be because God provides freedom from anxiety, right? I mean, it's all over the Bible. And it wasn't until I kind of matured through that and learned more that I realized He does indeed provide freedom from anxiety, but it's not a snap your fingers kind of walk away from it. It's a real mental disease like anything else that you need to get the right tools in your arsenal to combat. And He provides those too. So through a lot of searching and a lot of just work over decades, I found a set of tools that was very effective and is very effective for me. And today, I love talking about it because I love sharing the message that if you're a person out there who struggles with acute anxiety disorder and you feel like you're alone, you're not alone. If you feel like it's a weakness, it's not a weakness. If you feel like there isn't hope, there is hope. And I like to tell people that, in the midst of all that, I built multiple businesses, I raised a large family, adopted multiple kids. I've been married to the same beautiful woman for 33 years, and have had a very fulfilling life. And you can too, right? Anxiety doesn't have to be the thing that shuts you down and stops you from achieving your goals.
There's a couple of things that you noted. One, I want to talk about it because you mentioned that the Bible is filled with this language of Jesus being able to set you free, which I'm a pastor, you're a person of faith. I would agree with that statement wholeheartedly. And yet, you also mentioned that the brain sometimes, or the mind or the emotions sometimes, are sick. And that's not to say you're a sick person because you have this, but it's an illness. It is something that you don't always have control over to a degree. And on the last season of the podcast, a friend of mine who has dealt with suicide quite a bit in his life, he said it really well, and it really stood out to me. He said, the brain is the only organ that we shame when it fails. If you have a stomach ulcer, you don't shame your stomach. If you have a skin tissue disorder, you don't shame your skin. But the brain, for some reason, is an organ that we as a culture, we shame it when it fails. Like if your brain moves into a place of anxiety or you move into a place of depression, someone says like, well, hey, what's wrong with you? Or why are you thinking that way? Or just don't think about it like that, as if in some way you have some sort of determinative control over it. And I think that is part of the problem when you couple that with faith and you say, well, I should just pray harder. What it means is like, it's this idea of like, because you're not praying the right way, you're somehow experiencing this. But if you take a step back and you say, whoa, no, like something's going on in the brain and the body. And there are some realities where you just can't pray the anxiety away.
Right.
And talk about that for a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think I took a very similar approach initially. I can remember in my early 20s being in college and spending hours just thinking I have to pray harder and trying to do that, to pray my way out of what I was experiencing. And it was an honest attempt, but it was misguided. I was not looking at it like it's a disease. I was looking at it like it's somehow, like you said, a matter of failure on my part or a matter of sin. When in reality, it wasn't a matter of sin at all. It was a challenge that I was being confronted with, like any other challenge, whether I'd gotten diabetes or epilepsy or anything else. I needed to seek the right kind of help. And in God, being gracious, led me on a journey that involved all kinds of different things that I was able to discover. One of the first things I discovered was a self-help, or not a self-help, a support group, a therapeutic support group in Rapid City, South Dakota, where we happened to be living at the time, led by a counselor who practiced. He didn't call it this, but today they would call it cognitive behavioral therapy. But basically, what he was doing is in small doses, introducing us to this idea that we could confront our fears, we could confront our anxiety in manageable doses, and that was really game changing for me. This idea that I could walk into what I fear, and in manageable ways. Medication, right? I saw it, medical treatment, with medication, and medication was effective as well. Although, any one of these tools on their own, wasn't the answer. Like if it was just as simple as take enough medication, that's all I would have done. But it didn't do it on its own. If it was just as simple as practice cognitive behavioral therapy, face what scares you the most in small doses until you desensitize yourself to it, and then ramp those up. If that was all I needed to do on its own, that's all I would have done. It wasn't just that. God taught me a lot of other things too, and it really opened my eyes in a new way to what the Bible truly says about fear and anxiety and stress and worry, and allowed me to seek ways to release that to Him, along with the other tools that I was able to gain. And the more I practiced it, like anything else, I found the less of a monster it became to me, right? And the more manageable it became. And the more I realized that this is not a hopeless situation, that God is still in control, and that He has given me powers that I still have, and I just need to exercise those and practice those. And over time, doing those things, support groups, medication, cognitive behavioral therapy, prayer. One of the biggest things was, you mentioned I'm involved with a nonprofit in Grand Rapids called the Anxiety Resource Center. Starting that organization over 20 years ago is a place that stands unashamed to proclaim that we have anxiety disorder, and to provide a lending library and support groups and resources and talks for people that are struggling with it, and to take the stigma away from it. I mean, that was half the battle, because I think with anxiety, maybe much like depression, I know more about anxiety than depression, but half of the battle is hiding it. Half of the battle is being ashamed to admit it. And that keeps it powerful. And by standing up and going, yeah, and people would say to me back then, aren't you worried what it's going to do to your career? Or when I launched my first business, aren't you worried about what it's going to do to your reputation as a business owner? I ignored all that, and I was very upfront about my anxiety. And then I found out that lots of people have issues with anxiety, and they would share other issues they have with me. I mean, we're all broken. We're all in a world where we face our own challenges, and that kind of honest approach was at the heart of the healing. And that really is consistent with what I found in Scripture too: honesty and walking with other people. And that the combination of those things is what led me to a place of peace in my life.
I don't know if you are familiar with some of the research that comes from Dr. Kurt Thompson. He's written books on the soul of shame and the soul of desire, and he's done a lot of work with shame. And one of the institutes that he's put together in his practice is something called a safe confessing community. And it is essentially not just group therapy, it's a group conversation that is facilitated by trained therapists, where people get the opportunity to say and name their own shame and their own triggers, and then have it reflected back to them by those in the group that are safe, that they trust. And sometimes what will happen is one person, it only takes one, to share his or her experience with this shame, this pain in the past. And then somebody else can actually heal from having another person name a shame that they might not have even been aware of. And
Yeah.
and his research shows that one of the only ways to truly heal from these deep, shameful, traumatic experiences is in the context of that safe confessing community.
Yeah, yeah. I'm not familiar with his work, but that sounds right on to me and really powerful. And much what I've experienced in support groups that I've been a part of, and that's what led me in 1990, I don't know, 1995, to start the Anxiety Resource Center with a group of other people in Grand Rapids. I looked around. I wanted to experience the same kind of group support that you're talking about that I had experienced a few years earlier in my life in Rapid City, South Dakota, in my community, which at the time was Grand Rapids, Michigan, and I didn't find anything. So we started it and just took an ad out in the paper. This is back when people got the paper, you know, and it was just, hey, anxiety support group. If you struggle with anxiety disorder, show up. And I think we rented a room at the diocesan center there. And people started coming, and more people started coming, and more people started coming in. But that's what we did. And at the time, we weren't even professionally led. Today, the Anxiety Resource Center is led by trained professional therapists. Back then, it was just me leading the discussion. And I would say, hey, I'm just a guy with anxiety, and I'm willing to be honest. If you're willing to be honest, we can have a really impactful conversation. And we experienced the same thing of healing, whether it be shame or fear, or whatever we're faced with, just by being willing to be open and honest and to support each other and talk about it.
So I'm curious, your thoughts on this in terms of the stigma of anxiety, the stigma of mental health. Where do you think that comes from? And what do you think we need to do in order to move the ball forward in terms of destigmatizing?
I think honesty is what we need to do to move it forward. I think that there's this false narrative, and it may be more prevalent in men than women. I don't know that to be a fact, but I know from my own experience as a man, I always felt that somehow, if I'm honest about, being full of anxiety or panic, or having panic in situations like if I had to present in front of a large group, that somehow I'd be seen as weak or less of a man, and that was complete nonsense. I got to the point where I just embraced the danger and started to, if I had to present in front of a group, say right out of the gate, listen, you'll have to bear with me because I have horrible anxiety disorder, and I could panic to the point of blacking out. And so one of you guys is going to have to be ready to call 911 if that happens. And people would laugh. And you realize that you're not alone, that everybody in that audience, everybody you're talking to is struggling with something.
Yeah.
And I learned so much about people through that process of just being willing to be honest. But I think, to get to your question, I think the stigma comes from this fear of being weak or less than or not capable, whatever that means, whatever we built up in our mind, a truly capable, put together person looks like. We have this misconception of what that is, and it's not based in reality. It's not who people are. I mean, we all carry our own baggage in this world, and it wasn't until I was willing to set that aside that I found real power in being able to be out front and be honest about it.
Yeah, I have a rule when I meet with clients in my office, or I sit with people who are working through an unmanageable season of life. And that, honestly, that's what I try to call it. I don't try to say, hey, you're in an anxious moment or you're depressed. Are you in a season of life that is unmanageable? Like, what you're going through is beyond your ability to cope in this moment. One of my general rules is that you don't have to apologize for anything you say. Because inevitably, and I'm sure you probably had moments like this too, where if you start talking about you're overwhelmed, or you cross the street and you don't know how, you can't catch your breath, or you're up in front speaking, and all of a sudden you feel like this sense of panic, and then like you've got this emotional moment, and then you express yourself, and then you've been vulnerable, and then all of a sudden you have to say something to almost allow yourself to back away and say, okay, I was vulnerable for a moment, but now I'm okay. And so what do? You apologize. I'm sorry. I'm sorry that I shared that. I'm sorry that I felt that way. I'm sorry that I'm teary right now. I'm sorry that I'm putting this all on you, even though you're a therapist and technically it's your job. I'm still sorry. And what I found, and similar to that, is that there's this story behind sorry. There's this narrative behind sorry that is either, if I'm really vulnerable, then I'm not strong enough to handle this. Or if I'm really vulnerable, then I failed in some way, where I'm somehow not enough. I remember what Brene Brown said years ago in terms of her research. She said that men predominantly are afraid of failing, and women are predominantly afraid of not being enough. And I feel like those are really, honestly, the same thing. They're just nuanced and they express differently. But when a man expresses his emotions, it's almost like he's failed at being a man.
Yeah.
And when a woman expresses her emotions, it's that she's proved that she's not strong enough to handle this on her own, or not a good enough mom, or not a good enough wife, or whatever it is. And that all comes from this really deep, dark place of insecurity and a fear of vulnerability in the moment.
Yeah, it's all based on foundational lies we tell ourselves, right? I mean, I call it head trash, right? And it's similar to why anxiety is so hard. If you have anxiety disorder, if you have panic disorder as an example, it's so hard because much of what you're really anxious about is anticipatory, right? Your anxiety is just driven from the what if questions. Well, what if? What if I can never calm down? What if I panic so much that I pass out? What if I have a heart attack? What if, and there's all these what ifs that are rarely based in reality. They're not going to, I used to tell people that came to the support group, you can't panic yourself to death, right? I mean, you just can't. Um, but yet we do that to ourselves. Like we portray the worst possible outcome, and then it becomes self-fulfilling.
Mm-hmm.
And so, from the world of great athletes, we can learn, what they do. Great athletes, when they're preparing for a match or a game or some kind of contest, they'll visualize the positive outcomes, right? They mentally visualize things going well, hitting the home run, throwing the touchdown pass. Golfers hitting the perfect shot, they visualize what the shot looks like. And that's a way of kind of speaking into existence a positive outcome, because our bodies will react to what our mind sees. And if we feed it nothing but negative, which is hard not to do when you're in the grips of something like this, then you start to live that out. But it's breaking that cycle. And that's the thing that I learned from neuroscience and just studying anxiety disorder is all this is pathways in our brains. I mean, all this is just neural connections that have been reinforced over time because of negative thinking and because of experience. And we had the power to create those pathways. So we have the power within us to break those pathways and create new pathways. But it takes some work. You have to practice that. Early on, my wife made me a breathing exercise tape. It would be like box breathing. If listeners are familiar with that, just breathing in and holding for a certain count, and then, deeply from the diaphragm and slowly, and then releasing for a certain count, and then being at peace for a second, and then doing it again. And then muscle relays, and it would just be her voice saying, breathe in, hold, 1, 2, 3, 4, release, 1, 2, 3, 4. And I do this over and over again. And then muscle contracting and relaxation, same thing. And was interesting to me, because I realized I was a little less anxious if I practiced that. So I thought, well, if it's true that I can be a little less anxious by practicing that for 5 minutes, what if I practice it every day? What if I got really intent on practicing this? And then I realized I have the ability to control my physical feeling by what I do. Yep. And that was like mind blowing to me, because Initially, when anxiety first came into my, real prominent in my life, and where my life was unmanageable, like you say to your patients, at those points in my life, I felt like it was something being done to me, and I had absolutely zero control over it. And I lived in fear that it would happen again. And then I remember my therapist at the time in the group therapy, I got to a certain point with cognitive behavioral therapy where I was worried about panic attacks, saying, well, then why don't you just put yourself into a panic? Why don't we practice that? Why don't you start hyperventilating? Let's see if you can do that and then bring yourself back from that. And I started to get so bold as to do those things, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, People that have horrible social anxiety and are afraid of what people think of them or see in them, he'd have us do things like make faces at people in the crowd, right? Stuff you wouldn't normally do, but it was a way of breaking that cycle and realizing the world's not coming to an end,
Yeah.
right? We still have some control, but just changing that thinking and that narrative in our heads, which was based on false beliefs.
I love the just the multiple kind of thought process that you have in terms of, well, we have a trained neural pathway, but you can retrain a neural pathway and you have options and you have control over that. One of the things that I've found in at least my own therapeutic journey and in working with others is how surprised people are that they don't have to think that way anymore.
Yeah.
It's like a brand new world changing idea that, oh, you mean I don't have to think about that all the time. I can think about other things because we don't often think about what we think about.
Yeah. Yeah. And it takes, once you get some momentum behind you with something like an intentional methodology to attack anxiety disorder, you can increase the level and get to the point where you are, it becomes a passion. Like, got to a certain point in my life where I realized I would rather die than live in fear. I would rather die in what, and I didn't want to die, but I also didn't want to live the way I was living. So I was willing to step out into the danger and there's a phrase we used to use in the support group early on, which is the only way around it is through it, right? You have to go through it. And it seems daunting and it seems horrible and it seems terrifying, but it really isn't. And it's one step at a time.
Yep.
And I remember early in my marriage, there was a mountain range out west, and we had gone to this mountain. The idea was we were going to climb this peak called Harney Peak. And I remember thinking in my head, for some reason on the way there, I thought, well, this will be like an hour, there, up me climb back down. And then I'm reading the brochure on the way into the park, and it's like a 3-hour ascent and like a 2-hour descent. And I'm like, oh my gosh, and then the catastrophic thinking kicked in. But what happens if I have a panic attack on the top of this mountain or halfway up this mountain and there's no ambulance road to get up there? I'm going to be completely helpless. And, what if this happens? And what if this happens? And I remember saying to my wife, I don't think I'm going to do it. I don't think we should do it. I think we should turn around and go back. And she knew me well enough at that point in our marriage, God bless her, that she wasn't going to enable me. And so I remember looking at me going, well, you can wait in the car, but I'm climbing. And, I wasn't going to let her climb on her own. And I also didn't want to wait in the car for 5 hours. There wasn't a gift shop or anything. So, I just started taking one step after another. And I remember thinking, yeah, I could do this. Like I can walk this far. And if I can walk 20 feet, I can walk another 10 feet. If I can walk another 10 feet, I can walk another 30 feet. And we climbed this beautiful mountain, had an amazing time. And it was an analogy for me that just said, hey, all the stuff that I believe, all that what if thinking is really not based in reality. It has nothing to do with the experience I just had.
Yeah. There's an interesting mind hack that I use with clients who get into the catastrophic thinking. And it's similar to the approach that you have and some of the things that we're talking about. I just say, okay, hey, what's the worst case scenario? So there's three options that you can take. What's the worst case scenario? Worst case scenario in your option is I'm gonna I'm going to get halfway up this mountain. I'm going to have a panic attack. We're not going to have enough water. There's going to be a viper that's waiting out to strike me. I'm going to have a panic attack. I'm going to be dehydrated. The viper's going to strike me. I'm going to die and I'm going to fall. I'm going to take my wife with me. And both of us are going to turn into a puddle of mush down at the bottom of this mountain. And that's going to be the end of our story. I mean, that really is that if you're going to, and I have to take people to the extreme of like, no, like that's not the worst case. The worst case is not going to have a panic attack. It's not that you're going to be dehydrated. It's that both of you are going to die and life is going to be over and your children are going to be miserable and their futures, and you just failed them completely. That's the worst case. Well, then the next one is, well, what's the best case scenario? That's the one normally people don't go to. It's like, well, the best case is I'm going to go up the mountain and I'm going to have a great time and it's going to be a great view and life is going to be pretty dandy and like we're going to, and then, then the middle of the road is well, what's most likely to happen? Because the negative and the worst case is most of the time constructed from a place of reality that spins out into something that is not real, that is totally fabricated in your mind. But the truth is, the best case scenario is typically the most likely to happen, even just statistically speaking, in terms of, I'm going to die getting on an airplane. Well, statistically speaking, it's one of the safest places that you can be. Right. But again, we allow our narrative, this element of our mind to run amok, and giving yourself three options of worst case, best case, and most likely is actually mind tricking your brain into forming neural pathways while you're making decisions.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, I think that's really consistent with what I try to practice when I feel that anticipatory anxiety. I do the same thing and think in terms of, well, what's the worst thing that could possibly happen? I do a lot of public speaking now, and I never would have thought that would have ever been something I would have said early in my life. But when I'm going to give a public presentation, I still get nervous. I still get anxious. I still get uptight. And I will often use that technique and ask myself, well, what's the worst thing that can possibly happen? Well, the worst thing is I'm going to freeze up and I'm going to panic and I'm going to, have to excuse myself and step down and probably go seek medical help. Okay, well, what's the worst thing that's going to happen if that happens? Well, people will probably understand. I mean, it's not the end of the world, right? I mean, I'm still going to have my family. I'm still going to have my job.
Yep.
So I just start to go there and realize that this fear is not based and then to your point, I think about the best case. The best case is they're going to give me a standing ovation and they're going to applaud for 15 minutes and they're going to think it's the greatest presentation they've ever seen. Both of those are probably not likely. Both of those are, the reality of what's going to happen is somewhere in the middle, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And I can live with anything in the middle, right? It's the worst case that scares me. But just kind of trying to broaden my thinking helps me to get ready to step up there and start talking. And then, to a degree, I also am still at that point, not to a degree, absolutely. I'm at a point where in any of those situations, whether it be a case where I have to go speak, or if it be something else in my life that is causing me anxiety, I often just look at God and just say, God, I'm just going to leave the results to you. I mean, you brought me to this point and you've asked me, I believe you've asked me to do this. I'm doing this out of what I think is the right thing, where you direct me. So I'm just going to step out there and I'm going to see what happens. And I'm going to trust you with the result, whatever it is.
Yeah.
And that has impacted my faith in a whole new way for me, because it's one thing to say I have that kind of faith in the comfort and privacy of my own home. It's another thing when things don't feel right. And realizing that God's there in both scenarios. He's still there.
Yeah.
He's still in control, which is why I think there's so many verses on anxiety and on stress. I mean, when you start to really do an exhaustive search of what the Bible says about anxiety, it may be, and I don't know, but it may be the most talked about topic in the New Testament. There's so many verses that talk about being at peace and being at ease, and having freedom from fear. And that's there for a reason. I don't think it's there as a flippant statement to just say, just stop thinking that way. But it's saying that if you want to live a consistent faith with who God created you to be and truly trust him, accept the peace that he's already provided you and do the things that he's shown you to do, whatever those might be. We're all different. And for me, I have the things that I need to do. Physical exercise, another great tool. I would have thought, early in my 20s, I would have thought physical exercise makes no sense at all. If you're somebody that's worried about panic, are you going to go run on a treadmill or going to go for a run and get your heart rate up, get your breathing accelerated? That's scary. Well, once I started to do that in small doses, I realized I can do this. And the more I did that, the more the neural pathways changed in my mind. Those are all interrelated to me.
Yeah. Are you familiar with Still I Run and Sasha Wolf? They're a Grand Rapids-based nonprofit.
Yes.
She was on the podcast last season, and she talked about her own journey, honestly, about being at Pine Rest and all of a sudden learning that you could run for your mental health and that could make a difference. And again, it feels so counterintuitive, but the truth is, if there's something that works for you that doesn't have a negative side effect, I actually believe that's from God. I really do. God made our bodies to move. In fact, I've been doing quite a bit of talking right now about seasonal affect, and just and I think it's the sun is shining out by you. Maybe it looks like that,
Yeah.
but
Well,
it has not been for a good long while. In fact, this year, January and February, we had 9% sunlight comparatively to 20% over the last few years, and the last few years have been pretty dark as well. And when I was doing some reading on circadian rhythms, and when you think about it, so God in the beginning forms the world, but it says that in the beginning, God created the heavens of the earth, and then God separated the light from the dark, and the light he called day, and the dark he called night. And then there was evening and morning on the first day. That's how the whole world starts. It starts in this like rhythm of light and dark, or day and night. And human beings are created after that, which means even our creation story, the human origin story, is rooted in this regular rhythm of light and dark, or day and night. And the circadian rhythms, essentially, when we are waking up when the sun comes up and going to bed when the sun goes down, we're at our best. And when we have this period, this three-month period in the winter, especially in Michigan, which is where we both live, when we have that, it actually really jacks up our emotions, because our bodies just can't adjust to the same way that we rest. And then because we're not resting well, our bodies get inflamed. And because we're inflamed, we can't process through stress the same way. Cortisol levels don't work the same way. They don't regulate the same way. It just becomes a whole mess. And so all of us are just kind of longing for the light to return so we can get back to a normal emotional rhythm.
yeah. No, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, and I think it makes me think of other things too that are so important in this journey. What you eat, how much sleep you get, how much physical exercise. I mentioned that earlier. The words that you use to talk to yourself, right? I've been thinking a lot lately, and I think it's based on a podcast I was listening to where the speaker was talking about what our inner monologue sounds like when we're talking to ourselves. And too often, I hate to admit, my inner monologue is cruel, right? And you talked about, well, what is from God? And in the podcast, the host was talking about, he uses a simple gauge to try to distinguish if the voice in his head is overly harsh and condemning. Does that sound like God? At least the God of the Bible that I read? No. But often the voice in my head is that, right? Well, where is that coming from? That's not based on what I believe, how God would talk to me. So why do I talk to myself that way? And so just trying to regulate my own self-talk. I mean, I know it sounds it sounds silly, and we joke about it sometimes when I talk to people about this. It's like the old SNL skit: "I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and doggone it,
Gosh
people."
darn it, people like me.
Yeah, but just having that mantra of I'm going to be okay. I mean, things are all right. Things aren't as bad as all of that, and this will work out just fine. And I have choices, and I have options, and I have people that care about me, and just sometimes even verbally saying that stuff to myself helps. So all of the above: exercise, food, inner monologue, getting enough sleep, how all of that. It all kind of goes together into a melting pot for me of how do you live with anxiety disorder? Because I often will say, I'm not cured of anxiety disorder. It's a mental illness, like you said. I'm going to have it the rest of my life. I'm going to be a highly strung, anxious person the rest of my life. That's just how God made me, and that's okay. But that doesn't mean I have to live in misery and fear. It doesn't mean I have to live as a victim.
Yeah.
And that is I guess, the turning point for me. That's the point in my life I got to where I found freedom from fear. And on the podcast that I am launching with the Anxiety Research Center, which I've invited you to come be a guest on, that's what we're going to talk about: is how do you get freedom from fear? How do
Yeah.
you get freedom from that feeling of being helpless?
Yeah. I love that so much. It makes me think, um, that just one element of this that we haven't touched on is, where do you think social media and the media outlet in general comes into play in terms of fear?
Yeah, I think what I've noticed is we have a tendency to do the doom scrolling, right? I mean, if you just pick up your phone, even Facebook or just news, it's negative story after negative story after negative story. And I heard a guy recently, I think it was in a book I read recently, where he was talking about this concept, and he said, because it seems like, okay, well, yeah, I don't want to be ill-informed. The world is a place full of catastrophic events. And the point the author made in the book was, yeah, but how much of that do you see in your day-to-day life? Sure, terrible catastrophic things happen, but on a weekly basis, how much of that do you see in the world that you live in? Not a lot.
Right.
But if you pick up a news feed and you start scrolling through it on your phone, that's all you're going to see. So you're telling your brain that's the reality. And that's really not the reality. That's not the whole reality. It's what sells news articles. It's what attracts people.
Yeah.
The same thing on social media. The bizarre, the negative story, the embarrassing story, that attracts viewers, that attracts likes. So you got to be really careful what you feed yourself. And I'm not saying, be a hermit or a prude and don't pay attention to anything in the world. I'm just saying be aware of what you're putting into your mind, because your mind will pick up on that and neural pathways will form based on what you're feeding it.
There's a great book, The Gift of Fear by Gavin de Becker. I don't know if you've heard of that before, but he is Gavin de Becker runs Gavin de Becker and Associates, which is a protection firm in California. He is the world's leading authority on all of the predictive measures that lead to human violence. And the book is incredible. It's a fascinating read or listen if you're going through it on Audible. And for women who are listening, I think it's recommended reading for women. He talks about how women are the victims of violent crimes, and typically that comes from a romantic relationships. It's usually domestic violence. So he unpacks what to look for, all of that. But in the book, he gets to a section of the book where he talks about how the news capitalizes on fear. And his entire premise for the book is that fear is actually a God-given, he doesn't use those words. He says it's a human, response, but in my understanding, a God-given response to threatening situations. Like, God wired us to have a healthy amount of fear so that we could stay safe. And what he said is that watching the news, what happens is it actually hijacks you to be fearful all the time, instead of being appropriately fearful when you need to. And his whole point was, if you're always listening to the news, they're going to tell you need to be afraid all the time. And if you're afraid all the time, then the fear response that you have is not going to go off when you need it to for your own survival. And I
Right.
thought that was probably one of the most profound ideas for me as I just processed through. Yeah. I mean, he even walks through, he's like, if the news has nothing new to report, do you know what they'll do? They'll go back to this day 10 years later and find something negative to report. So they say Columbine 10 years after the fact, where are they now? And it's because they've figured out and they've dialed in how to commoditize or monetize fear for their own purposes.
Yeah, it's interesting. A book I just got done reading is called The Mental Game, Winning the War Within Your Mind. I don't know if you've heard of this book.
Part of it. Yep.
The author, and I wish I could remember the author. I'm looking on my Kindle here to see if I can find it, but it keeps opening the book every time I do that. Darren, it's Darren something. But it's a fable about a pro golfer who has a panic attack meltdown on like the 18th hole of a tournament, and he seeks help from an older, uber successful golfer who's a Hall of Famer. And the help he gets is not what he thought he was going to get. He thought he was going to get help with his game. What he got was help with his mind. And he talks about the same thing, about, being really cognizant of what you're seeing, what you're reading, what you're telling yourself, what you portray in your mind before the event happens, because our bodies will follow. If we tell ourselves it's all negative, it's going to be tense. It's going to be, if we were going to a party tonight, my wife and I told myself all day long, I'm going to be uncomfortable. I'm going to be tense. I'm going to be anxiety ridden. I'm going to be panicky. I'm going to be, I'm going to feel awkward. The chances are pretty high that by the time I get there, that all those things come true. But if I say the opposite, I'm going to be at ease. I might be a little nervous like everybody else, but I'm going to laugh. I'm going to enjoy myself. I have a much higher chance of enjoying that event, right? So our bodies do follow what we tell our minds, and the book takes this fictional story of this golfer learning these techniques and what it does for not only his golf game but for his life, and it's full of a lot of truths that at least I've experienced in anxiety. And he's one of the people that talks about your self-talk, and he doesn't say it this way either, but the implication for me was that's not the way God would talk to us. That's not the way, that voice is not from God. That's from somewhere else, but it isn't from God. So why would I talk to myself that way? Or would I talk to my own kids that way? Like, would you berate your kids constantly? You wouldn't. You try to uplift them. You tell them some hard truths, and that's okay to tell ourselves hard truths, but you'd also try to uplift them and show them the positive side of what can happen. That's a whole different dialogue, or at least monologue, that I've had during big chunks of my life internally.
Yeah. The podcast episode before that we just launched on Chaplaincy on the Go, we interviewed a man named Steve Cuss, who's written a book on managing leadership anxiety, and he just came out with another book called The Expectation Gap. And one of the practices that he teaches people is to, in those moments, allow God to have the first word and the last word of your anxious thoughts. And so give yourself permission to say that thing to yourself, but let God have the first word and let God have the last word, because there is a stark contrast, I think, between if we have and I think this is important too, if we have a right understanding of who God is. I think some people, maybe because they've been through the church and they've been hurt, or maybe they had a bad experience with religion, they may not see God as loving and kind and gracious. But if you read the New Testament, you read about Jesus and you read about this God of the Bible, you'll see a different picture. And if you can have that picture of him, you see the picture of the one who says, "Hey, I'm with you. I'm for you. I love you. I believe in you, and it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. And you are not the sum of your thoughts or failures. You are more than that." And I think that's a really important component of this journey.
Oh, absolutely. What was the name of that book you said that he wrote?
Managing Leadership Anxiety. And he then also wrote The Expectation Gap, which is pretty much part 2 of his first book. And he runs an organization called Capable Life, which is essentially about how anxiety blocks our ability to be close and relax into God's presence. And so I think you'd really dig his stuff for sure.
Yeah, I'll check it out for sure. That's great.
Well, I just thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, Mike, and I'm so grateful for the time. As we sign off here, I'd just love to give you the last word to people listening and maybe a word of encouragement for them.
Absolutely. If you are a person who's struggling with anxiety disorder, panic, generalized anxiety, OCD, whatever it is that you're struggling with in the realm of anxiety, just know that you're not alone, that there's millions and millions of us that have been through it and are going through it, and there is help. And if you're interested in a great organization that can help you, the Anxiety Resource Center based in Grand Rapids, Michigan, has online support groups. So regardless of where you're listening to us from, check out their website at anxietyresourcecenter.org, anxietyresourcecenter.org. There's a lot of services available, resources, and online support groups that you can check out. And I just encourage you to do that and to not travel this journey alone.
Mike, thank you so much. We will have all the links to that in the podcast show notes as well, and we will talk with you later.